Chapter 2. When the door closed behind my father, I suddenly felt very alone and afraid. "Come along," said the maestro coldly. The darkness of the room paralyzed me. The maestro doesn't seem to be very friendly, I thought, but he isn't going to eat me. I have to. "Come on! Are you hard of hearing or just stupid?" he barked. I grabbed my satchel, and he pushed me into a narrow hallway just behind the curtain. The hallway led to a smallish room with two doors, one of which opened onto the kitchen. The other door was closed. There was a stone staircase in the corner. "Melania!" yelled the maestro. A damp smell from the terracotta tiles that covered the floor stuck in my throat. I set the satchel down at my feet. "Melania!" he yelled again, louder. The sound of halting steps announced her arrival. "Coming, coming," she said in a deep voice. Then, as if to herself, she added, "Some day that beast will wear out my name." "Well, what is it?" she said, standing in the doorway that we had just come in. "Prepare lodging for this boy." Melania hit her hip with her hand, and a cloud of dust or flour escaped from her skirt. "Another boy? There's no room for another in the sleeping quarters. They'll suffocate in there." With his foot, the maestro pushed my satchel into the middle of the room. "Here, take his things. Make a place for him where you can, and don't give me any more problems than I already have." Melania abruptly picked up the bundle and gave him a look and walked away muttering, "Problems, problems. His only problem is his bad temper." Shaking his head, the maestro walked over to the closed door and opened it. A stream of light filled the room. "Go in," he said. It was the studio. There were tables, easels, benches, a real studio. 3 boys were working in the room, also apprentices, I guessed. They all looked up from what they were doing as we entered the room. "Piero," the maestro called to a boy working at one of the tables. "Give Arduino an apron and show him how to prepare pigments." I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself that I was just shivering from the cold. Piero was much taller than I, pale and thin. He looked at me without much interest and handed me a stiff, dirty apron. Then he showed me a table with rows of flasks containing colored earths and bowls with greases and liquids. "Take the mortar and pestle and crush these chunks until you have very fine powder," he said. "When it's completely ground, put it in here." He pointed to a bowl. I picked up the heavy pestle and began to grind the green-colored earth. Some pieces flew out of the mortar. "Don't thump so hard and use more precision," Piero explained, "and be careful, because the powder is very poisonous." I began again, this time with better results. Piero returned to his work, and I continued quietly, enjoying the regular grinding rhythm of pestle against mortar. After a while, one of the other boys in the studio came over to my table, put on an apron, and took a mortar. He was heavy-set and had a red nose. We worked in silence. In the huge room, the only sounds were the syncopated clicks and thumps of the mortars and pestles. Suddenly he spoke. "How old are you?" he asked. "I'm going on 14, I answered. "Ha! I'm 15. He smirked and then chuckled to himself as though the fact that he was a year older was very funny indeed. Then he blurted out, "I am Baldo Ferruccio. I am Antonio Ferruccio's grandson." I felt a flash of envy. Antonio Ferruccio was a famous painter of altarpieces. For Baldo, it would surely be simple to become a painter. Before I had a chance to say anything, the maestro called me over to his table. He was holding a small drawing. "Tell me, what do you think of this?" he asked. The picture was a sepia pencil drawing of 5 figures, 3 women and 2 children. The composition of the figures, the balance of the shapes, and the complexity of the light and shadow were extraordinary. But at that moment I couldn't speak. I could only feel a white heat that seemed to imprint the vision in my brain. I had felt that way before when looking at a painting, the arch of a church, my grandfather's face in the firelight. "Well," said the maestro, "I'm beginning to think you really are hard of hearing. I asked you what you thought of this drawing. It's very, very beautiful," I stammered. "Do you recognize the subject?" I couldn't think. I shook my head. "You're religious, aren't you?" "Yes." "Yes, maestro," he corrected me. "Look, this is Saint Anne, here is Saint Elizabeth, and on the right, Our Lady, the Virgin Mary." He was staring at me. I nodded. "And the children?" he asked. "Baby Jesus and Saint John the Baptist." "Very good, very good. Perhaps you have more in your head than brocades and baubles." He began to laugh, but then his laughter turned into a rude cough that forced him to leave the studio. When I returned to the mortar, I saw that the green earth was strewn over the table and that the powder I had ground was laced with black earth and pebbles. Baldo's smothered giggles told me that this was a prank reserved for the new boy in the studio. "It was you," I said to him. Baldo snickered. "What's so funny? You must think you're very clever. Well, you're not. You're a fool, a clown, What's going on here?" roared the maestro from the doorway. I thought quickly. If I told him what had happened, the other boys would hate me, and I did have to live with them for the next 3 years. "It's nothing," I answered. "I was distracted and I mixed the pigments by accident." The maestro shuffled over to the work table and examined the mess. "What waste!" he grumbled, his mouth missing some teeth, let fly little drops of spit. "These earths are expensive, especially the green, which is scarce. You can't just throw them around. Now save what you can and clean up the rest. Don't let it happen again." He walked away muttering. When Cosimo was out of earshot, I said to Baldo, "Don't you ever play another trick on me. I don't want the maestro to think I'm careless." Baldo snorted in response. I spent the rest of that first morning grinding pigments and putting up with the laughter that Baldo seemed to be holding back between his cheeks and his nose. We stopped working to eat lunch. The meal was a thin broth with strange pieces of meat that Melania, groaning and complaining, served in earthenware bowls on the greasy kitchen table. Back in the studio, the afternoon passed in much the same way as the morning. When the light began to fade in the studio, we left our work and returned to the kitchen for evening chores. "Someone needs to fetch the water," said Piero. "Let Arduino get it. The new boy always gets it." It was Marco, the boy who had been working at an easel in the back of the workshop. From his tone of voice, I knew I didn't have a choice. Outside, it was very cold. The autumn wind cut through my thin doublet. When I got to the well, I lowered the bucket carefully. At home, I had never been allowed to get water from the well. It was considered too dangerous for me, the youngest, though I knew how it was done from watching my father. When I figured the bucket was full, I began to pull on the rope. I could barely budge it. "Let me help you," came a voice from behind me. It was Piero. It was a difficult job, even for the two of us. After much heaving and straining, we were finally able to rest the bucket on the edge of the well. When we returned to the house, we joined Baldo and Marco for the rest of the chores. We got wood for the hearth, shuttered the windows, cleaned the stable, and groomed the maestro's aged horse. Exhausted, we trudged back to the kitchen for supper. Melania set out bowls of bread and milk. We all ate to the accompaniment of Baldo's slurps and stories that Melania told us in hushed tones about the demons, devils, and crazed criminals that wandered the streets. I soon learned that her storytelling was a regular event at supper time. Despite their morbid topics, the stories took our mind off the cold drafts around our ankles and the meager food. When we were through eating, we helped Melania wash the dishes and headed off to bed. I still felt hungry, though I didn't ask for more. It was my first day, and I didn't want the others to think I was greedy. Piero, Baldo, and Marco slept in a room that was barely big enough for the three of them, so for my bed, Melania had put down a straw pallet and a blanket on the floor underneath the stone staircase where it wouldn't be in the way. I lay down. I could smell straw dust, and the blankets stank of sweat and damp. I tried not to think of the sheets on my bed at home, which were always scented with mint. Melania had put out the candle in the kitchen, so the room was nearly dark. Moonlight slid through the cracks in the shutters of the small window on the far wall. Though I was tired, the newness of my surroundings kept me awake. I could hear the mice scratching behind the wall and other unknown noises that seemed to come from above. I went over the thousands of details of the day, which made me temporarily forget my hunger and cold. Finally, I began to drift off, thinking of the marvelous drawing the maestro had shown me. I was in this near-sleep state when I felt a human presence near me. I was wide awake in an instant, though I didn't move a muscle. I heard soft footsteps. I opened my eyes as wide as I could, straining to see into the darkness. But from where I lay, I was hopeless. Whoever it was began to climb the stairs, carefully so as not to make any noise. I slowly sat up to get a better look and saw, thanks to the light coming through the cracks in the shutters, Melania tiptoeing up the stairs with a bundle in one hand and a pail in the other. After a while, she came down with the same care and disappeared into the kitchen. Who or what was upstairs? And why did Melania go there in the middle of the night? I tossed and turned for a while, wondering about what I'd just witnessed. Finally, exhaustion got the better of me, and I fell into a fitful sleep.